Cuba, the largest island in the Caribbean and a global hotspot for culture, music, and nature. Despite its undeniable natural beauty, the island itself holds a dark past riddled with slavery, conflict, and missiles. Today, we will explore deep into this rich past as we look at Cuba during imperialism, the world wars, and of course, the Cold War.
When explorer Christopher Columbus reached the shores of Cuba on October 28th of 1492, he discovered an island so stunning that he declared it the most beautiful earth that human eyes had ever seen. After 2 years of exploring the coast and seeing roughly the 100,000 locals living there, Columbus declared the island for Spain. By 1526, the Spanish had already set up multiple settlements and had mapped out the entire island's coast and were ready to start putting the land to use. Thousands of slaves were directly part of the transatlantic slave trade. The slaves were used to produce sugarcane and other profitable crops.
Throughout the 1600s, Cuba continues to depend on its sugar plantations. Havana is declared the capital of Cuba in 1607 and becomes an essential trade port.
After hundreds of years in relative peace, the 18th century became a turbulent time for Cuba. During the 7 Years' War, British troops occupied Havana through force. In 1763, at the end of the war, the British returned control of Cuba back to the Spanish. Imperialism continues.
After 300 years under Spanish rule, Cuban freedom fighters retaliated against their imperialist leaders in 1868. This conflict was called the Cuban War of Independence and would last for 10 years. The war ends with a ceasefire after Spain promises reforms in the Cuban government.
In 1886, 21 years after its powerful neighbor, the United States, Cuba finally abolishes slavery. This major economic switch makes Cuba much less valuable to the Spanish. Seeing an opportunity to finally rid the Spanish of Cuban control, famous poet Jose Marti and powerful military leader Maximo Gomez lead the Cuban War of Independence in 1895. Towards the end of this long and grueling conflict, a mysterious explosion sank the important U.S. battleship, the USS Maine, which causes the United States to also declare war on the Spanish. With help from the Cuban army, the Americans win the war and become the Protectorate of Cuba. 4 years later, in 1902, Cuba gains independence for the first time since 1492.
Tomás Estrada Palma is elected as the first Cuban president in 1902. His first major political move was Cuban-American Treaty of Relations, which leased the prison Guantanamo Bay to the United States.
On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand is assassinated, and 70 days later, war breaks out in Europe. The president of Cuba at the time, Mario Garcia Mensah, known for his strong support of business and corporations, at first stays neutral. This all changes, however, when in 1917, the United States joined the war. Possibly hoping to strengthen their governmental bond with the U.S., Cuba joined the war 1 day later.
After winning with the Allies in World War I, a former general of the Cuban War of Independence, Gerardo Machado, takes power in 1924. Through vicious labor reforms and complete military and political power, he creates a dictatorship. After keeping Cuba locked in a dictatorship for 9 years, Machado is finally overthrown by a military coup. After this coup, the United States finally abandons its right to intervene in Cuba's international affairs. Multiple presidents would keep power until the start of World War II, where former military general and Cuban strongman Fulgencio Batista is elected as president.
In World War II, Cuba would fight alongside the Allies from 1940 to 1945. Due to their limited army and navy, their support was limited, but they still managed to make a difference, being held by Rear Admiral Samuel Eliot Morrison as the most cooperative and helpful of all the Caribbean states during the war. Across the conflict, the Cuban military would sink 1 U-boat, catch multiple German spies, fly 83,000 hours on patrol duty, and rescue over 200 U-boat victims.
Towards the end of World War II is successful and Batista regains power, installing a dictatorship. Under his rule, crime flourishes and corruption runs wild. Many civilizations come to realize that this ruler is a disaster and that something must change.
In 1953, a young attorney named Fidel Castro attempts to lead the Cuban Revolution to dethrone Batista and gain back Havana, the country's capital. Castro and his fellow revolutionary Che Guevara used guerrilla warfare to defeat the Cuban military and exile the unjust Batista. Castro becomes prime minister in 1959. When the Cold War reaches Cuba, they ally with the Soviet Union. This ally of the countries was very worrying for the United States, so in 1961 they sent 1,500 Cuban leaders and soldiers who were previously exiled back to Cuba with the hopes of overthrowing Fidel Castro. This mission was called the Bay of Pigs. Castro, however, was ready for this and set up defense on the Cuban beaches. As the rebels arrived, gunshots rang out, and by the time the dust settled, all the United States deployed soldiers were dead or captured. This horrible failure only secured Castro's role as prime minister.
In 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis occurs after the Soviet Union installs intermediate-range nuclear missiles in Cuba. To prevent the Soviets from delivering more missile systems to Cuba, the U.S. Navy establishes a blockade and promised to fire on any Soviet ship that attempted to break the blockade. This leads to a tense standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union, which at one point came close to a nuclear war as a Soviet submarine almost launched a nuclear missile at the U.S. Navy after it misinterpreted a practice depth charge as an unarmed depth charge. After days of tense negotiations, the Soviets agreed to pull missiles out of Cuba, after the U.S. promised to pull missiles out of Turkey.
Fine ladies and gentlemen of Cuba, I come to you today bringing great news. Our army has finally pushed the evil rebels off our island, saving us all from the evil reigns of communism. With this great victory, I bring a gift to all of you. I will continue to rig the elections and stay dictator of Cuba forever! Disgusting filth!
People of Cuba, is this what we have become? A community rigged through dictatorship and violence. This unjust reign has destroyed our reputation and our government, and I mean to restore both. We will ally with our communist brethren in the Soviet Union. We will help and guide Nikita Khrushchev through the war to come. The United States will try their very best to stop us, but we will not bend or break. At this very moment, Soviet missiles are being transferred to our island just in case the United States tries to confront us again.
Cuba has been heavily affected by these world affairs. Due to imperialism, they were unable to make their own alliances and partnerships under Spanish rule. This led them to be a relatively weak country after gaining independence in 1902. Cuba used the world wars to regain alliances after joining the Allies and used the security to rebuild their own government. Of all these events, however, the Cold War affected Cuba the most, as it helped secure a dictator, Fidel Castro, into the front line of Cuba's political sector. It also caused them to have tensions with their powerful neighbor, the U.S., and allied with equally powerful Soviet Union. In conclusion, these three massive sections in history have affected Cuba in a variety of ways. Imperialism made their government weak and inefficient, while the world wars helped them bring power and security. The Cold War uses newfound power and launched Cuba into an important and powerful country, thanks to nuclear weapons and massive allies. It also, however, brought them conflict and insecurity. Their history may be spotted with inconsistencies, but in the end, it brought them to a good position today, as they have a grown government and many allies, including the Dominican Republic, Peru, Uruguay, and even Iran. Thank you for listening to our documentary.